Buonasera, buonasera a tutti, grazie per essere qui con noi in questo webinar dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni, il 31 di ottobre, forse una data, come dire, non usuale per questo genere di attività, però siamo molto felici perché abbiamo con noi due amici, Michele Silenzi e ovviamente Rainer Zitelmann, per parlare dell'ultimo libro di Rainer, che a differenza dei precedenti, La forza del capitalismo, Elogio del capitalismo, Ricchi borghesi, ancora pochi mesi, che è un'analisi veramente interessante e da leggere della percezione della ricchezza in diversi paesi. Ecco, questo suo ultimo libro, Il viaggio della libertà, un giro del mondo alle origini della povertà e della ricchezza, è pubblicato non dall'Istituto Bruno Leoni, ma dagli amici di Liberi Libri. E quindi io cederei subito la parola a Michele Silenzi, scrittore, ma anche editore con Liberi Libri, per presentarci brevemente questo progetto editoriale, magari cominciare dalla bellissima copertina di questo libro.
Grazie Alberto e grazie all'Istituto ovviamente per ospitare questo bel webinar. E grazie a Rainer soprattutto che ci ha dato la possibilità di tradurre questo libro che è unico nel suo genere a suo modo. È una cosa che si dice spesso, però questo lo è davvero. Perché? Perché in 2 anni, lo riassumo brevemente, semplicemente le ragioni che come editore mi hanno spinto e hanno spinto la casa editrice a fare questo libro. In 2 anni, dopo il Covid, quindi questa è una cosa anche estremamente interessante, quindi dal 2022 al 2024, Rainer Zitelmann ha girato davvero per tutto il mondo, proprio alla ricerca, cercando di capire dove stanno le cause appunto della ricchezza e della povertà di determinati paesi. La cosa interessante, sopra ogni altra, è che ovviamente è stato negli Stati Uniti, è stato in Inghilterra, ma la cosa affascinante è che è stato in paesi che di solito ovviamente non vengono considerati e che pure sono i casi più affascinanti, i casi più esemplari delle tracce e delle testimonianze che Zitelmann traccia in questo libro. Di fatto, l'esempio che personalmente mi ha più convinto e coinvolto è quello dell'Albania, interessantissima la storia che Zitelmann ricostruisce nel libro e il salto che il paese è riuscito a fare, sta riuscendo a fare, uscendo fuori da un passato che molti di noi sanno tragicamente legato a un comunismo della più radicale e peggior specie. Ma c'è anche il caso della Mongolia, ad esempio, e quelli assolutamente esemplari, su cui Rainer, tra l'altro, ha scritto anche un altro libro, nello specifico del Vietnam e della Polonia. L'ultimo inserto è di agosto 2024 ed è ovviamente una testimonianza sull'Argentina. Zitelmann era già stato in Argentina, ritorna ovviamente dopo la vittoria di Milei. Il libro copre davvero tutto il mondo, con l'eccezione sostanziale, ma in realtà comprensibile, dell'Africa per molti motivi, ma è fortissima la narrazione che Zitelmann ci restituisce di tutta della situazione generale del mondo e della relazione tra ricchezza e povertà. Perché? E concludo. È così interessante perché lui va sul posto e non va ad interrogare persone a caso, ma va dagli attori principali dello sviluppo dei vari determinati paesi, degli imprenditori, degli intellettuali, dei politici. Quindi diciamo va alla radice della questione e ne mostra in maniera secondo me chiarissima, ma soprattutto, che è ciò che spesso interessa a un editore, estremamente appassionante e coinvolgenti, delle idee che per chi segue Liberi Libri, per chi segue l'IBL, per chi segue ovviamente la produzione bibliografica di Zitelmann, ovviamente sono idee affini, ma dispiegate, analizzate, comprese e viste nella pratica di chi sta lì tutti i giorni come politico, come imprenditore, come intellettuale che cerca di svilupparle e di metterle in campo. Quindi è un libro che sono stato felicissimo di poter fare e di poter e di poter proporre. E chiudo rispondendo sulla copertina, che è opera della nostra bravissima Romina Donnini, che come tu sai è la capa, diciamo, della nostra redazione, è colei che tiene in mano le chiavi della Liberilibri.
Salutiamo Romina che è sempre bravissima e anche questa copertina è veramente molto bella. Io aggiungo solamente una cosa, è un cliché quasi l'idea che si impari attraverso il viaggio, no? Siamo tutti convinti che viaggiando si impara, vedendo luoghi diversi, conoscendo realtà differenti, parlando con persone che hanno una storia diversa dalla nostra. Però non è così facile poi fare del viaggio materia viva per trasmettere, per esempio, le idee politiche, per ragionare sulle idee politiche, come invece Rainer con la consueta maestria di storico di formazione, ma anche di, diciamo così, giornalista quasi naturalmente, oltre che per professione, poi di uomo d'affari, cosa che ha fatto in gran parte della sua vita, riesce a fare perché mette assieme appunto queste prospettive diverse, tutte preziose, ma che raramente si trovano nella stessa persona, come nel suo caso. Rainer, you can be sure we just said very nice things about you.
Thank you.
Don't worry about that. It's great pleasure to see you as always, albeit only at a distance. So this book of yours is a little bit like a classical liberal around the world in 80 days. So let me ask you a very, well, perhaps a very stupid question, but one which is, of course, of interest. Which is the country that impressed you the most of all of them, of all that you visited?
A good question, but hard to say. You know, I'm not married, and this is why I haven't found the perfect woman. And the same is with the country. I'm living in Germany because I haven't found the perfect country. There are a lot of countries where I really liked things or admired things, but in the same way, I'm very negative to other things. I give you one example. I heard you spoke about Vietnam. In a way, I admire these people because it was the poorest country in the world in the 90s, poorer than all African countries, and they could blame the Americans or French, or they had war with Japan, with China, with France, with the United States, but they didn't blame them. They took responsibility for their bad situation, and they understood that it was due to this planned economy, and they implemented free market reforms and implemented private property, and the result is that the number of people living in poverty decreased from 80% to less than 5% in only a few decades. So I admire these people with an entrepreneurial spirit, but on the other hand, of course, it's a one-party system. There's no freedom of press. I have problems to publish my books there. I publish some books, but with other books, it's not possible to publish them there because they don't fit to the party line. So as it is with Vietnam, it is with a lot of other countries. I found some things very impressive and other things negative.
You make that point very forcefully in the book that, there's no perfect country. There's no quote unquote 100% capitalism, beginning with Switzerland, which is the first country that you visit in the book. And of course, you're there with libertarian friends. And as always, libertarian friends see the negative of their government. They say, Switzerland is a quasi-socialist country. But of course, compared to what? So if you compare Switzerland with Italy, for example, it is clearly not that easy to be that negative about Switzerland. So it's a matter of of comparing. It's a matter of understanding that, there's no perfection around. But there are trends. So there are countries that are doing better than they did in the past, and there are countries that are doing worse than they did in the past, from the point of view of economic freedom. And of course, we may think that the point of view of economic freedom is, so to say, the first step to assess economic growth more generally. Now, you visited Chile, and you got very strong relationship and bonds in Chile. Chile used to be a tremendously successful country, sort of the poster child of the neoliberal model, whatever it means. But now politically, that's a place where the tide has turned quite dramatically in the last few years. Can I ask your impressions, your hope, your views about Chile?
Yes, and let me add something. Before I visited these countries, I commissioned a poll in every country about the image of capitalism and the image of the market economy. And some people were surprised when I found, as a result of my surveys, that the image of capitalism and of the free market economy was much better in Argentina than in Chile. And they said, it has to be wrong in a way. We know that the Argentinians are Peronist and people in Chile are pro-capitalism. So someone told me, it's clear that there is a mistake in your survey. But what happened? 4 months after our survey, people in Chile voted for a socialist. And 1.5 years after our survey, people in Argentina voted for Javier Milei. So you have to distinguish between two things. The one is the objective economic structure of a country as we see it, for example, in the index of economic freedom, how economically free is a country. But this is a result of the past. And I want to look a little bit in the future. So what people think today may be a reality in the future, as it happened in Chile. First, people changed their mindset, whether in a positive or a negative direction. And then only later, there's a change, for example, in the politics or in the economy. And this is what happened in Chile. And you are correct. It's crazy that Chile is by far the most successful country in Latin America, always very high rated in the index of economic freedom. And the life there is much better. You see it I was before I went to Chile, I was in Argentina or in Colombia. And so then when you arrive in Chile, you see it even at the airport, or if you go to the town, to Santiago, I was reminded much more to Europe. It's a big difference. And you see it on first glance that people are much better off. And so the question is, why did they vote for a socialist? And I found out that this happens all the time, that after a time, people forget why they became successful and fall back to their old bad habits. Let us compare with an example. Imagine there's someone who ate a lot of pizza, chocolate, and became more fat in the end, 160 kilos maybe, not muscle, but fat. So then he starts making a diet, stop eating pizza, stop eating chocolate, and all these things. And in the end, he has a great body with maybe 80 kilos. And then after 1 or 2 years, or maybe after 3 years, he thinks, I have no problem with my body and all this. Why shouldn't I eat a pizza? Then he starts eating a pizza, and what happens? Nothing bad. It's not like he wakes up next morning and he's fat again. So he says, okay, let's eat another pizza tomorrow, maybe as a dessert, a chocolate or ice cream. And what happens? Not much. Maybe after a month, he gained 2 kilos. Okay, 80 kilo, 82 kilos. He still has a great body. And you know what happens? He goes on, and in the end, he's fat as he was before, maybe even worse. And this is the same with the economy. It happens all the time. My country is a very good example. In the end of the 90s, Germany was the sick man of Europe. We had a lot of problems with a lot of people without jobs. And then Gerhard Schröder, the chancellor, and at this time he started economic reforms, lowering the taxes and liberalization of the labor market and all these reforms. The result was that this economic situation in Germany became better and better and better for a long time. But then, in the time of Angela Merkel, there were not only one positive economic reform. On the contrary, they took some of the reforms back, and even they started with restructuring our energy industry in the direction of a planned economy, restructuring our automotive industry in the direction of a planned economy, and all these crazy things. And what happens now? We are again the sick man of Europe. And this is what you can see all time, everywhere, the same China. In 1981, 88% of the people in China lived in extreme poverty. And then Deng Xiaoping started his economic reforms, implemented private property economic reforms. The number of people living in poverty decreased from 88 to less than 1%. From 88 to less than 1%. And it's a great success story in China. You said it one time to me, Alberto, even you don't need pure capitalism, even some drops of capitalism helps a lot. I quoted this very often. You found a perfect formulation for this. And this is absolutely true. You see it in China, for example. But now what happens? They forgot why they became successful. And this Xi Jinping starts with going back to more state, less market, and again, they cause problems. And so this is not only Chile. You can see it all time. We have to fight for, it's not, we have to fight one time for freedom and then we won and everything is great. No. Again and again in every generation, and maybe even several times in every generation, we have again to fight for freedom.
I think, if it is a bit of a depressing message, but let's try to look at it in a positive way, which is cultural changes are actually faster than we typically believe. I mean, a culture of a country can change real fast. This is what you said before, looking at the perception of capitalism in Chile and Argentina. Culture is not something which is, written in stone. Economic growth, in a sense, happens first of all in people's mind. Is how they see themselves, how they see what they can do, and it can change. People can change their perception of markets, of business, of their own future. I think this is a great takeaway of your book, but also of your previous book, like of course the one that we published about the perception of wealth all over countries. There was a book that showed, some surprising data. For example, the change in perception of wealth and entrepreneurship among young people in the US versus in Europe. So apparently we do have some hope for a freer Europe in the future, whereas in the US you saw before others that the tide was turning in the direction of more government intervention, which is what happened, didn't it?
Yes, and people ask me sometimes, what do we need to change? Of course, this is the question, our situation. What should we do to come to economic reforms? And I think the lesson of history is we need three things. The first thing is a change in the mindset. This is what you mentioned. It's the same for the individual as for a country. If you want to change your life as a person, as an individual, first you have to change your mindset, and then you can change your life in the next step. And this is what happened in the United States before Ronald Reagan came. There were people like Milton Friedman, and there's Free to Choose things, and Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, and so on. And the same before Maggie Thatcher was successful in the UK. There was the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute for Economic Affairs and all these things. And in Argentina, I was this year in Argentina, last year in Argentina, 2 years before in Argentina. And I write about this in the book about my experience. And I saw that there was a huge activity from think tanks, like you have this Bruno Leone think tanks. They had a lot of activities there, very successful, to change the mindset of the people. But this is only one thing. The other thing is, things have to become really absolutely worse and really extreme bad before there is a change. Unfortunately, I know no example in history where there was a country where things were more or less better, and one day people said, okay, let's start with some capitalist reforms because we think that we will be much better off when we did this. I know no example. I know only examples like in the UK with Maggie Thatcher. In the 70s, the UK was the sick man of Europe. Everyday strikes and so many unemployed people and inflation and all this. In China, I mentioned the situation, 88% of people living in poverty before Deng Xiaoping came. Argentina now, it was so bad. Inflation rate was 25% per month, not per year, when Milei won the elections at this time. By the way, now it's 3.5% today. So I could mention a lot of other examples. But pay attention. A bad economic situation is a necessary but not sufficient precondition for change. It's not automatically, if things become very bad, then things start to become good. It's not, history is not like a Hollywood movie with a guarantee of a happy ending. Things can become worse. Also, one example, Venezuela. In the 70s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world and the richest country in Latin America. Then they started with regulation, labor market regulation, and so on. And things became worse. But then they didn't vote for a politician with free market reforms, but they voted for Hugo Chavez in the end of the 90s. And then things became still worse than this. So a very bad economic situation is precondition number one. But the change of the mindset is important, because this is important how people will interpret this change situation and the solution. And the third thing is then politics, the last thing. Then you need, of course, a politician, maybe a Hollywood actor as Ronald Reagan, maybe someone with a chainsaw, economist like in Argentina, maybe an Iron Lady like in the UK. Of course, you need politicians, but this is the last step only. And so I think this is how we can change things. And for this reason, it's so important what you do with your think tank. But maybe let me add this. I met people from think tanks in 30 countries, and I found a lot of really great people, and they did great things. But I saw also why, for example, Milei is more successful than people from think tanks in a lot of other countries. And one reason is, and this is the problem in our libertarian movement, that there are some people who love to be the minority, in a way like a cult or like a sect. We are the true believers. Here I have a Hayek quote, Mises quote, or no, Rothbard, and here's 100% anarcho-capitalism, and everyone who thinks a little bit different, he's wrong, and We want to have the pure, not as you said, some drops of capitalism help. No, we want 100%. And even if it's only 99%, this is bad because it's not 100%. And so let's stay only our small group of people, our true believers, and all the others, they don't know. So this is the same like maybe Scientology or cult. And I think this is the difference what Millet did to understand that it's not only about like think tank, but action tank, to do things, to understand marketing, to understand public relation, to understand communication, to understand building yourself as a brand. And all these things are as important as economic theories. And I think this is a lesson that a lot of think tanks can also learn from my experience. So as I see it, what I saw all around the world.
I'd like to speak about Millet later. Let me just point out that one interesting thing about Millet is that, of course, Millet's language is extremely radical. So is in many ways, his ability was to mobilize people on a language, a way of framing the Argentinian situation that others considered too much. People thought, Millet was a fringe guy, will never convince people in the center. Before Millet, we had Macri. There was a great hope, a very senior industrialist, but a failure as politician. And in many ways, I think Millet is an interesting personification of the peculiar set of talents that you really need in a desperate situation, which is not necessarily and not exclusively a clear thinker, but also somebody who has an ability to engage with people in a new way. But I would like to speak with you a little bit about Europe, to go back to something that was pretty much in the news a few weeks ago. As you may remember, in September, Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB and the former Italian prime minister, has published a report, a very long and detailed report about the European situation, highlighting some of the problems and Europe lagging behind in economic growth to the United States and missing a tech sector vis-a-vis the United States experience. But his key solution for all these problems was basically massive public investments at the European level to bridge the gap between the EU and the United States. Now, I thought it was very interesting that some intellectual leaders and also some treasury officials from Eastern Europe have been the strongest critics of the Draghi report. And they said, basically, this may be true of Western Europe, but the story of Eastern European economic development since the 1990s is a different one. And I think you know very well this country, Poland, but not necessarily only Poland. And I wanted to ask you, do you think Eastern Europe is, on average, doing much better than the West? And if so, why? Because some of this country had great economic reformers and some of them so-and-so, but will really change over there. I think it's the mentalities, the viewpoint of the average guy.
Well, first of all, I read this Draghi report, and I think the analysis, what is wrong, and that Europe lags behind Asia and the United States, is right, but the recipe is absolutely nonsense. And it's because they believe they have a wrong interpretation of what happened in China. They think that China was successful because of massive state intervention. But this is wrong. I have a friend, Wayne Chang, at the Beijing University, and he repeated time and again, we were successful not because of the state, but in spite of the state. And they don't understand it. So in a way, I think it's the secret role model is China, but because they don't understand what happened in China, first thing. But now your question about Eastern Europe. I think we have to distinguish. There are some countries unfortunately only very few, where the reforms went very good and the standard of living increased dramatically. I would mention especially Poland and the Czech Republic as two examples. And then there are others.
And the Baltics.
And the Baltics, absolutely, the Baltics. And then there are others that a total failure and a catastrophe. It's like
Ukraine.
Russia, ex-Yugoslavia, like Serbia, also Albania. And then there are some that are a little bit in the middle, like Romania and Bulgaria. And I thought in my poll, the most positive attitude toward capitalism from 35 countries was Poland, number one. And also in the Czech Republic, they have a very positive view of capitalism. And the worst opinion about capitalism was in countries like Russia and Serbia and Montenegro, this ex-Yugoslavian countries. And in Bulgaria and in Romania, it was in the middle. So there's a correlation between how successful the reforms were. And the problem is that what they called privatization in some countries, like in Russia, was not privatization, but it was establishing a kleptocracy where some people like Putin steal the property from people. You saw it exactly in Russia. It started in 2003 with Kholodkovsky when Putin. You say it in Russia, the loss of economic freedom always starts with the loss of private property. First in 1917 in the Russian Revolution, and then in 2003 with Kholodkovsky and all what has happened. This is a perfect example that you see how important is private property, because the loss of economic freedom started with this. If you ask now about Eastern Europe, so you can't say it in general. The countries are so different. For example, Albania. Of course, people in Albania are better off than in the time of Enver Hoxha. Of course. In Enver Hoxha's time, I think it was the poorest country in Europe. And even in 1990, they had not a single traffic light. It was not necessary because there was not a car. There were only 1,200 state-owned cars, but no private-owned cars. Today you have this traffic jam very bad, as you know it, in a lot of countries. But what happened in Albania, a part of the former elite and others, they are now involved in organized crime. They call it the Colombia of Europe. And when I was there in Albania, we have, to be honest, a lot of Albanian people here in Germany who have not a very positive image, more the image of criminality. And so I had a little bit fear. A friend of mine sent me a text message, take care about your watch and everything in this Albania. Then I asked people there, I was a little bit afraid, here, is it dangerous here in the city? No, it's absolutely safe. And I asked, why is that? I wonder that. And they asked me, don't you know how we make our money here in Albania? No, I don't know really. Oh, yes, it's half GDP is from drugs. Yes, and all this organized crime. Don't you see all these cars here, this Maserati, Lamborghini, and all this? And it's organized crime. It makes no sense for them to steal some €100 from any tourist. They earn much enough with all their organized crime things there. So this is really a bad situation. And then there are countries like Georgia where it was. This is terrible now. They started so well like 10, 15 years ago with economic reforms. And now it has a lot to do with Russia, of course, because this Russian influence in some of these countries is very strong. And but I love Poland. Yes, they, if I was, I think, a dozen of times in Poland in the last two years, and it's really amazing what happened there. Of course, they should have much more economic reforms now. It's far away from being perfect, but I think one difference to Western countries is what I like more in a country like Poland. They are not so ideology driven. We in Germany, it's all about we want to be the world champions in open borders for migration and healing the whole world. And of course, the world champions in climate change. We want to be the role models for the whole world and the best climate change policy and all this stuff. In fact, we are not far away from this. We destroy now in Germany, and the European Union does it, our European automotive industry with their planned economy, with that they phased out or that they banned the new registration from cars with combustion engines. And all these ideology-driven things are not so strong in countries, ex-communist countries, even like Poland or Vietnam. They are more pragmatic. They are more as we were in the 60s. They look for economic growth, improving the situation of ordinary people, and this is their priority and not the ideology-driven project. So this is
yes,
what I like.
And of course, any country has problems, and everything is always a mixed bag. We will all be very happy to have a flat tax like in Russia, because it's still very low as compared with others. Poland is a great country in terms of economic freedom, but is also a country in which in recent years energy companies and banks have been renationalized. So you always have problems, but you do have opportunity. And when it comes to Albania, let me assure you, we just translated Istituto Bruno Leoni's comic books into Albanian and started disseminating them over there. So this will fix most of the problems, not all of them, but most. But you made a very interesting reference to China being the model in a wrong way of the European ruling class. And I think you're really right. For many years, we got this narrative of capitalism with Chinese characteristic. So we as Westerners, instead of appreciating China growing because they got a little bit of economic freedom, we all thought, they're growing, they got a strong party in charge, so you can have economic growth and state capitalism, basically. And this is more or less what the European Union has been trying to do in the last few years. So you think that, how big you think is the responsibility of intellectuals who have so egregiously misinterpreted what was going on in China?
Yes, absolutely. You have a lot of economists, and I think you have people like, I think you wrote a book. Yes, you wrote a book about her Mazzucato, this Italian economist, and I think her ideas are very similar, that the state can do everything, that the state even invented the iPhone and some crazy things like she said. No, of course, it's wrong. It's a wrong interpretation of China. I wrote more about this in my book. You published it. Thank you for this, the power of capitalism. I have a chapter there on China. But let me give another example that shows that these ideas are wrong. Let's speak only like 2 minutes about the new space industry. We had this moon landing in the end of the 60s, great thing, but cost $200 billion in today's money. It was a great thing, but after this, they failed. For decades and decades, this space shuttle was very, like every flight, $1 billion. It was crazy, and two were even destroyed, and and man didn't come back not to the Mars and even not to the moon. So it all in all, there was some success in unmanned space travel, of course, but all in all, it was not the breakthrough that we expected maybe in the end of the 60s. And the launch costs, for example, to bring a payload of 1 kilogram to space remained like $10,000 for a kilogram over a period of 4 decades. And then came Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and other private companies, and he reduced it from 10,000 to maybe 2,000 or 3,000. And I think he will choose it much, much more, because now he has this reusable Starship rocket. What's a great thing, the NASA, they tried to do it decades and decades and without any success. And they invested much more, billions and billions. And Elon Musk did it only with a fraction of the money. And I think this is a perfect example. And we should talk much more about it, because everywhere in the world we have the tendency, maybe since 20 years, more state, less market in almost every country. But there's one industry that is an exception, and this is the space industry. And the greatest success came in this industry. And I think this is the best argument against these economists who believe the state should plan it. If the state would be so great, why was NASA not able to do all these things that Elon Musk did, for example? They have much, much more money. No, the secret is that there are now hundreds and hundreds of companies. They call it new space, and they compete each other with innovation. And of course, a lot get broken, but some are very successful. And this is what capitalism means. And we in Europe, this is a tragedy. It's with artificial intelligence and with the space industry, the same thing. The Chinese and the Americans, they make great success, and we make great regulations in the European Commission, while they work on artificial intelligence and why they work on new rockets. And so we work on new regulations. First, you want to have more and more regulations. And this is the reason why we fell more and more behind the United States and maybe even China.
Well, I know that the space industry is something you're working a lot on these days, and I just like to remind our friends that are watching that you got a series of articles on this matter. Some of them were translated into Italian and can be easily found online. Vorrei inoltre dire, quindi vi ricordo che Rainer Zitelmann ha scritto molto su questo tema della privatizzazione dell'industria aerospaziale, del mercato dell'industria aerospaziale. Trovate molti dei suoi articoli sull'inchiesta, comunque tradotti in italiano, quindi cercate Zitelmann spazio, ma vi chiederei anche, se avete delle domande, visto siamo in conclusione, di farcele pervenire per iscritto anche in lingua italiana. Sarà un piacere farle a Rainer dopo quest'ultima. So I got a last question, and then we see if our listeners have some. And my last question is, of course, about Javier Milei. You've been a very vocal supporter. You met with him. You wrote about him. And we know that Milei has been so far extremely successful. First of all, has put back on the map, a set of ideas that were vanishing in Latin America, and perhaps not only there. But now, the first months have been, I suppose, I would say, more successful than most people hoped for. How do you see Milei doing in the future? Where do you expect him to be 1 year from now?
Yes, first of all, unfortunately, I hadn't had the opportunity to meet him in person. I met a lot of people, leading people from his party, and I saw him at a lecture. And I know that he's a fan of my books, because sometimes he posts my articles, and in interview he mentioned my books. But I was always there for a time when he had no time for meeting, for example, 2 days after the election. But yes, I know a lot about him, because I was there now every year and spoke with the people. I think it depends on one thing, whether he will be successful or not. And this was the message. I had a lot of lectures in different cities in Argentina. What I told the people, it all depends whether they are patient or not. Why? Because the lesson from history is that if you start free market reforms, some things become better, but also a lot of things become worse first. And not only for a couple of months, like a lot of people think in Argentina, but maybe 2 or 3 years. I spoke about the example of Poland when I've been in Argentina. They compare very often Milei with Trump or with Bolsonaro. I think this is totally wrong for several reasons. I saw a lecture from Milei where he spoke about how he bought 50 books in a couple of days and then read all these books, and sometimes with only interrupting, going to toilet for a minute and then going on reading these books. I can't imagine Donald Trump spending days and days and books, because I think he would prefer watch some wrestling shows or something like this. So maybe the way they speak or the marketing, the self-marketing seems to be similar, but it's quite different. I would like to compare Milei more with Balcerowicz, who did these reforms in Poland in 1990, because they are both economists. They are both economists, and they both believe in the same teachings as you and I, Mises and Hayek and all this stuff. So they share the same convictions. They are both economists, and the situation of Poland was in a way very similar to Argentina. They had a very huge debt in Poland, one of the biggest debts in the world. They had a high inflation there in Poland, 600%. In Argentina, it was almost 300%, and a huge state intervention. So they had a lot of things in common. And so I told people in Argentina, look at Poland. You can see two things. First, this shock therapy can work. It worked in Poland because Poland became Europe's growth champion. From being one of the poorest countries in Europe, they became Europe's growth champion. But the next lesson, and this is much more important, they had 2 bad years with negative GDP and all this stuff, and with increasing unemployment, at least in the official numbers, because in socialism there was 0 unemployment. And so, and this is what happens now in Argentina. In some ways, things become better. Yes, inflation rate decreased, but some problems become even bigger. And it's logical. You can't fix things in a couple of months that went wrong over decades and decades and decades. You know, Argentina was 100 years ago, I have the story all in my book, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, only comparable with the United States. And then with this Peronism and all this things, this right-wing, left-wing socialism and whatever, so it was a process over decades. And of course, Milei can't fix it in a year. Yeah. And so my answer, will he be successful or not, is, will people be patient? And I asked it to a lot of my friends in Argentina. Some were optimistic, and so far, you see the latest polls, he has, yes, still 55% approval in Argentina. This is great. But some said, no. People in Argentina are only patient with Peronists, but they were never patient with others. And so I hope these people were wrong. So let's see it. And there are other risks. For example, the most important thing is that no one will kill him or that he will be healthy, because I think a lot depends about him. I don't know what would happen with his movement. It depends a lot about Milei as a person. I met other people from his movement. There are also other good people, but it depends too much on him. So I hope, I will be optimistic, because when he wins, the first thing will be a capitalist revolution in Latin America and a lot of other countries. But it will not be only important for Latin America, but all over the world. People will see it work, and it's a great role model. But on the other hand, if he fails, they will come to you, Alberto. Get away with your crazy libertarian ideas. Yes. Haven't you seen Argentina? It's stupid. It's crazy. It didn't work. It failed. And your ideas will fail also. So then we have a big problem. Of course, then you can say, yes, but it wasn't true our libertarian ideas as a socialist.
No,
Yes.
that works only for communism, unfortunately.
Yes.
We do have a question that's actually a wonderful way to close our conversation, because Giulio Cotogni is asking you a very profound question, which is the following one. You said, of course, that nations forget what made them prosperous. The fat man forgets how, the man that slimmed down forgets how he got better. But Giulio Cotogni is asked, where do these cultural shifts come from? Shouldn't culture have aspects of persistence over time? That's a question for the historian.
Yes, I think we all forget bad things. When you were addicted to alcohol and you stopped drinking, why do so many people go back drinking? Because it's how our brain works. That remember the last time when you were at the dentist and maybe you had a very bad surgery and someone would ask you one day later, you have to go again, and no, get away with this. But now later you forget it, or even sometimes if you had a love relationship with some good, but then in the end very bad experience, after some weeks or months, things become better and better. Yeah, how you remember it. I think it's good from our brain. It helps us. I think otherwise we couldn't survive if we wouldn't forget all these bad things. But in some cases, it's really bad, as with a diet, as with a man who addicted on alcohol and all these things. And so what should we do to remind people to remember what happened? And this is, of course, what teachers should do at school or at university. But we know that they don't do it. They don't know about it. They haven't heard about socialism. This is the reason why in the 90s, 80s and 90s, we had such a great situation. I think in almost every country, the zeitgeist, how we call it in Germany, I think even in Italy, it was pro-free market in this time. And in Argentina it was. And it was everywhere in the world. This is what I learned. Today it's all around the world, this zeitgeist. Why? Because it was not so long ago the collapse of socialism and of communism. Everyone saw it. The planned economy doesn't work. Capitalism is a better system. Now, this is 30 years ago, and people get older, and the young people, they should hear about it, how crazy socialism is. But who tells them? The teachers? No, absolutely not. I can tell you one experience that I had in my world tour. I had a lot of lectures, sometimes with only 20 people, sometimes with 200, sometimes with 2,000. But in every lecture, I asked one question. Have you heard about the biggest socialist experiment in history, Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward, where 45 million people died? 45 million people died. Have you heard about it at school or Europe? And wherever I spoke, whether it was in Asia, Latin America, Europe, or the United States, only very, very few people raised their hand. They haven't heard about it. And I think this is so terrible. It was the biggest socialist experiment in history. So many people died. And this is the reason why I'm writing my books. And even in this book about my world tour, I should mention it because our audience, I hope they will read the book, but they haven't read it. It's always also about history, because before I traveled to a country, I studied the history of this country. I read books, for example, Romania. What happened in Romania? What happened in Bulgaria? What is the history about Poland? What is the history of Vietnam? And so on. And you find it in the book. You find the history. You find the results of people. I spoke with entrepreneurs, with politicians, with think tanks. And you find the results of my polls, what people think, and my personal impression. So I mixed it all. And I think history is so very important, and I think to read the book is a way also to learn a lot about the history of a lot of countries.
Rainer, thank you very much. You'll be pleased to know that Michele Silenzi and Libri have just published a very nice little book offering an analysis of Italian textbooks in school, written by Marco Bassani, Carlo Lottieri, and Andrea Zeni, and proving how tremendously biased all of them are. Thank you so much. I hope I'll see you soon in person. And let me just remind our audience, lasciatemi solo ricordare il viaggio della libertà, l'ultimo libro di Rainer Zitelmann, lo facciamo vedere ancora, pubblicato da Libri, tra l'altro online c'è anche un non grandissimo ma piacevole sconto se lo acquistate dal sito di Libri. Gli altri libri di Zitelmann li trovate per IBL Libri. Buona lettura a tutti. Rainer, thank you so much, as always.
I thank you, and I want to add something. You in Italy, I have more than 100 books at home, my books in different languages. But the most beautiful books are always from Italy. This book, also, I remember the book about the rich people, and my last book about, how do you call it, Elogio
del capitalismo.
Yes. These books, this is Italy. Now you understand why Italy are the best in fashion and all these things. So I want to thank you for this. I want to thank you for this conversation.
We do the Lamborghini of books.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, both
Thank
of you.
you.
And I look very much forward to come back to Italy. In 10 days, I will go to Vietnam to have my next film.
See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye.